maritime with the honors and the physics department. So we will be hearing from Sebastian Linnell-Simmons, who is a first-year student who is undecided but maybe studying finance. We'll be then hearing from Janzen. He's also a first-year student, political science and criminal justice, double major. And then we'll be hearing from Mariah Music, and she is also a first-year student in political science with a minor in peace studies. And then if our fourth joins us, that will be Shami Al-Hamadi, who is a second-year student in international affairs. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Sebastian to tell us about his work.
Hello, my name is Sebastian Linnell-Simmons, and my university writing paper was on the harm of distant water fishing. And it is not going in right. Let's see how we do this. Okay, so background to my paper. I apologize, it looks like the format is off. But so my paper revolves around the distant water fishing and illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, mostly conducted by China. So distant water fishing is when a country fishes not inside of its exclusive economic zone, which is a 100-mile radius off of their coast where they technically own those waters. Anything outside of that is international waters. Illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing is anything that international law constitutes as illegal to conduct while you're fishing, which is fishing endangered species, fishing in another country's exclusive economic zone, and not reporting the quantity of fish you catch, which means that you're overfishing and will decrease the biodiversity. And I focused on China because they have the largest distant water fleet and contributes to about 60% of the global distant water fishing market. So why I chose this topic, this was not my original topic that I wanted to do, but it's the one I ended up doing. I originally learned about it from a Coast Guard JROTC presentation, where we talked about the process of patrolling a country's borders on the ocean, and like what certain things you have to look out for, and one of them were these fishing vessels that would come over from other countries and try to fish. And I wanted to learn more about that and how it impacts these countries around the world. So my initial research question was, how does IUU fishing and distant water fishing affect foreign economies? And my initial hypothesis was that China's distant water fleet is affecting the foreign economies where it fishes in such a way that it will harm their local economies. And my methodology, so how I conducted my research, I initially looked at the GW library, and they actually have a lot of databases for each different subject that you're studying. So I primarily went to the economics database, where they have a bunch of different sources for different research based all around economics around the world, whether that be in different economic sectors for each country, so like minerals, fish, agriculture, or for just international trade and how countries relate and how they conduct their trade. So that was very helpful for finding like these big sources with a large amount of data to pull together. And then I had to do some future research or some further research to find specific like niche topics for like how it's conducted around the world. So the main sources that I conducted was Our World in Data, which pulls together a bunch of data from a variety of sources and shows them in a clear timeline, so you can see how different things change over time. Specifically for me, it was the fish stocks or the fish populations. I looked at the Global Fishing Watch, which, if you know flight radar, it's a very similar thing but for fishing vessels. So you can track the geolocation of fishing vessels across the oceans. And the Environmental Justice Foundation, which is a foundation that was investigating the different Chinese corporations that were operating within Ghana. So certain problems I met while I was doing my research was some red herring data. I specifically was trying to look at this through an economic lens, but I found a lot of things talking about ecology and sustainability, such as bycatch, where I was trying to talk about how the methods that were being conducted were actually harming the biodiversity, but it wasn't telling me a lot about the overall economic impact for each country. So I really need to focus on pushing that data to the side and incorporating it in a way that made sense for my paper. And also finding scholarly sources There are a lot more news articles and investigative journalism done into my topic, but very little actual data that was being collected. So it was much harder than I originally thought to pull together all my research. So my results, our rolling data, as I said, had a lot about the fish stocks, which is basically how much you can fish while still being sustainable. And you can see over this about 50-year period from 1970 to 2018, most of the major fish groups had their fish stocks decrease. While they're still overall sustainable, it was very much decreasing, which is a sign of overfishing, which when you think about it, if a country is overfishing in their oceans and then goes to another ocean or another country's easy to fish there, it'll also decrease the fish stocks there, which overall lessens how much fish they can produce in their country for their economy. There are a few exceptions to this, mostly being perch and rockfish and cephalopods, which are like octopi and squid, which are more anomalies and they're not commonly sought after for the global fishing market. And then it also included data for the fish stocks by region, which I focused on South America being Argentina and West Africa being Ghana, which you can see it decreases especially a lot for South Africa, going below the line of 1 for the fish stock, which means that it's actually unsustainable to fish anymore there, which it has been since the year 2000 up until 2018. And for West Africa, there was much less data, but you can still see that there are signs of decreasing, and it very much also crosses below that 1 threshold where it's being unsustainable to fish there. A second one was the Global Fishing Watch, which this is a hard picture to examine, but I'll do my best, where the group of green lines is a Chinese fishing vessel that was observed from February to May of 2024. And this black zone in the middle is the Argentinian exclusive economic zone. So this is Argentinian waters where this Chinese vessel is fishing right along the border, which while technically legal, is still going to harm the Argentinian fish stocks, the Argentinian fish populations, and ultimately the Argentinian economy by decreasing how many fish the local fishermen can actually catch there and sell for their own benefit. And more importantly, you can see where they cross into the exclusive economic zone, which is illegal according to the United Nations Conventions of the Law of the Sea. So by using this geolocation data, we can see how these Chinese vessels are breaking international laws for the primary goal of economic gain. And then this this picture on the right shows where Chinese vessels have been sighted throughout 2022. And you can see some major hotspots are around the Chinese Sea, which makes sense and is valid, but there are also major hotspots across the Pacific Ocean, around the Galapagos Islands, and Argentina specifically, where their borders are much harder or much less enforced rather than more rich and wealthy nations. And finally, the Environmental Justice Foundation, I apologize for the blurry image, but this was a congregate data of about 8 Chinese corporations that were operating vessels within Ghana. And in total, they made about $200 million in the year of 2018. And I think the more important thing to focus on is the 6th column, which is the number of trawlers under the Ghanaian flag, which is where these Chinese corporations have made a deal with the Ghanaian government to operate vessels with the Ghanaian flag, which means it is legal to fish there, but all of the profits are not going to the Ghanaian people and instead are being sent to these Chinese corporations and only benefiting the Chinese economy. My findings pretty much summarize in all of what I just said. The health of fish stocks are going down, which means less fish are able to be caught each year and less money is able to be produced for each of these local economies, specifically Argentina and Ghana. And China is conducting IUU fishing along borders like in Argentina, which is illegal activity, goes against international laws, and however they are still not being punished. And Chinese-owned companies are operating in foreign countries in a way to get loopholes and get around the international law, which is legal, but will still take away profits from local communities. So does this support or refute my hypothesis? Not conclusively. There's absolutely evidence that China is profiting from fishing in other countries' exclusive economic zones illegally and by owning companies that operate within these countries. They are able to make money, they are taking away from local economies, It is a bad practice and it should be prevented, but it is not heavily enforced. However, there was not enough data to show that the fishing sectors in countries like Argentina are harmed. I did not have the data shown, but their fishing sector is actually still being improved and they're still making more money each year from it. So it is a negative practice that is being conducted by China, but there is not enough data to show that it is fully being impacted on that economy. Thank you very much.
Thank our speaker. And some questions.
Any questions?
Save questions for the end.
Oh,
Do the 3 talks.
do we?
I'm sorry. But
Oh. Okay, all right. All right, in that case, we can move on to our next speaker, Jen.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Jen Valencia Tao. I took UW 1020 in the fall of 2025, and my class was called Dining on the Past, Food and Archaeology with Dr. Quave. And my research paper is titled Feudalism and Feast, Peasantry and Nobility Diets in Medieval England. So the main goals of my research project, the overarching one was examining how past foodways, so that refers to culinary practices and cultural values associated with those culinary practices, influence the present, as well as assessing the significance of those culinary practices. And aided in this research goal are 2 other research goals, one of them being analyzing archaeological evidence, so that can be castle sites. I'm looking at medieval England, so there's a lot of castles in medieval England. And another one is also looking at multidisciplinary perspectives, so incorporating other disciplines such as like art or history, which I incorporated into my paper, and looking at those findings and seeing how those findings can also add to what we know from archaeology. Okay, so my research question was actually broken down into 2 parts in order to address all of the goals effectively. My first part was, it reads, how was food used during medieval England between the years 1000 to 1300 as a marker of class and social status, and in particular, what key differences existed between castle-dwelling nobility and lower-class peasants. So the second part of my research question aims to identify the multidisciplinary aspects of the research goal, and it reads, how have historians and archaeologists approached the study of medieval food differently? What kinds of evidence do they use, and where do their interpretations diverge? So some key findings from my research, I included my paper, I organized my paper rather, into 4 distinct sections: dietary differences, bread and governance, hunting and cooking, as well as art and history. Just a quick note on art and history. I won't be going into that entire section, but I will be incorporating what I learned from art and history disciplines throughout the presentation. So the sections that I just mentioned, they both aimed to address the goals of looking at how archaeology can tell us what we know about medieval foodways, as well as looking at how art and history can add to that perspective. So starting off with dietary differences, grain for peasants formed largely the overwhelming diet of what they ate. So estimates suggest that a family comprised of 5, they ate roughly around 11,000 calories per day, and that those calories amounted to 80% being grain. One important thing is that grain doesn't just include wheat, that also includes things like barley and oats, which was the most common form of grain that peasants would eat. Peasants would use grains like barley and oats to make pottage, which was a thick stew that they sometimes would also incorporate dairy such as cheese and milk into, and occasionally salted meats, so they could like sprinkle salted meats over sort of kind of like bacon. Grain cultivation was very dominant in English agriculture. Millions of acres were dedicated to its production, and the system wasn't just about abundance of food. It was also mostly about survival and being able to actually have sustenance for peasants, there was not a lot of surplus to spare because that went to their lords. And so for them, this grain was really about survival and all about basic sustenance of their needs. However, not all grains are equal. For example, while grain often referred to barley or oats, wheat was something that was very different. Today, we're most familiar with flour as a form of grain production, and refined wheat flour used to make white bread was very, very labor-intensive and expensive. The whiter the bread, the higher status of the household, and white bread also became a visible and edible marker of wealth amongst feudal society. Darker bread made from barley and oats were more associated with the lower classes. Another key difference is that meat consumption really indicated whether someone might have been a peasant or might have been part of the nobility. For example, fresh meat that the wealthy consumed, including beef, pork, poultry, and lamb, was not widely available to the peasant class, whereas the peasant class were more limited in what they ate. They didn't have the options necessarily economically to eat a lot of fresh meat like the nobility class. This is an image of Pontefract Castle, which is in England, and there is a lot of archaeological evidence that was extracted from the castle, and it showed that a lot of beef, venison, swan, freshwater fish like pike and carp, as well as imported foods such as figs were recovered. And really interestingly, the presence of non-native fruits such as figs and also marine species demonstrated long trade networks and also the wealth required to transport these perishable goods from the coast inland as well. So for example, like if you're transporting saltwater fish from the sea, from the coast into the inland, that's not an option for someone who doesn't have a lot of money to do that. So it was really a sign of how wealthy you were or how like your status in the feudal system. So moving on to my next finding, bread was very, very important in feudal society. It really formed the backbone of like what people ate. To understand class division in England, I think it's important to understand how bread was used as a form of governance. The assize of bread referred to regulating weight and price to prevent shortages, as well as to prevent unrest. Sometimes there would be riots over the price of bread. And in rural England, lords would often force people to pay to bake bread in these big communal cooking ovens. And this system not only regulated food production, but really, I think, reinforced the economic dependence and class tension that existed in feudal society, because control over bread really meant control over both what people could eat and also the production of the bread itself, so the labor. And I think this is really a really interesting photo of a bread oven that was actually in Belgium, but this represents kind of like the idea of like a communal oven that people were using at that time. In feudal society in England, it largely was similar to what happened in Belgium, so we can kind of draw parallels between the different societies in Europe as well. So moving on to my next key discovery, which is about hunting and cooking. This really refers to the process of how people got their food in the first place as an indicator of their wealth. So hunting illustrates food as almost like a way to gain status, where deer hunting, for example, was reserved almost exclusively for elites. There were actually laws that said that you could not hunt in certain areas. And so that was really a way to reinforce class division and class tension among feudal society. It really symbolized control over land and resources, and archaeological studies show that about 90% of bird remains at most sites belonged to domesticated species like geese and chicken. Wild species such as partridge appear primarily in high status sites around castles, so such as like Pontefract Castle. And at places like Oakhampton Castle, wild game functioned less as a dietary necessity and more as a display of your privilege. Hunting rituals, ceremonies, and restrictions therefore really reinforce the elite identity that a lot of the nobility class had. Another really, really interesting, important part of the actual cooking process is the use of color. So for example, food presentation carried intense symbolic meaning, where medieval cookbooks revealed deliberate intention to color food certain ways. For example, foods that were colored with more like yellow tones were actually related to the idea of lightness and purity. This also had a lot of religious symbolism tied into it too. Techniques for producing blue foods. There's like a blue stew actually that I found in this medieval cookbook, which is called The Form of Curry. Really interesting cookbook. And it really just demonstrates how food, the use of color in food was kind of like a way to uphold social hierarchies as well. So going on to answering the overarching question of how do past foodways influence the present, the implications is that medieval foodways continue to resonate with our society today. Studying medieval foodways is not really just about reconstructing diets, but looking at how pop culture, like for example, I looked at Shrek and just like kind of how like medieval food and Shrek kind of relates to what I found in my research. And I think also more importantly is that food isn't really just about the ingredients, but also like the significance that the color has, that the types of food being cooked has, as well as also looking at how archaeology has its limits in what it can tell us. And that also kind of ties into how we need art and history perspectives as well to help us understand feudal England. So, thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Mariah Music, and today I'm going to be discussing the project I conducted in my university writing course on risk communication with Professor Beverly Sauer last semester. My project specifically focuses on the risk that faces rural and low-income communities within America when they apply for FEMA aid after a natural disaster. To narrow the scope of my project, I specifically focused on the 1,000-year flood that took place in southeastern Kentucky in July 26th of 2022, and that did not end until August 2nd of 2022. The flood began early in the morning of July 26th, and the rain officially stopped on July 28th, which was the peak of the disaster, which was when President Biden declared a natural disaster, and the Kentucky National Guard was deployed. Because of the narrow terrain and landscape of the mountains, the flooding did not stop until August 2nd. I specifically focused on Perry County, Kentucky, which was one of the 13 counties declared a state of emergency in this time to further narrow the scope of my project. The flood was incredibly disastrous for the area. It had approximately 44 deaths, and approximately 9,000 homes were damaged. People had to be rescued because there were no signs of incredible flooding coming, so they were not told to evacuate on time. 1,400 rescues were conducted, and 600 had to be by helicopter because of how serious the floods were and with the narrow terrain of the mountains as well. Another key finding I had throughout this was that 95% of homes did not have flood insurance in this area because it was too expensive. So I coined this FEMA application a second disaster for rural and low-income communities that were applying, because not only did they have to face the original tragedy of the flood or whatever natural disaster takes place, they have to go through a second process when they apply for FEMA aid applications, and they are continuously denied because of the convoluted process to apply for FEMA aid. There are hundreds of regulations and things that they have to go through and documents they have to supply that rural and low-income communities are just unable to do, and they are not instructed to do it properly, which leads to higher rates of turning them down when they apply. So in eastern Kentucky during this flood, victims were specifically told to apply for FEMA aid so that they would be able to finance the rebuilding of their homes, most of which in Perry County had been completely swiped off of their foundation. The homes were completely washed away, and they had no means to recover from that. Governor Beshear announced in a press release in September of 2022 that 50% of the applications in that flood were immediately denied, and 40% of those applications were denied because of ownership verification issues. When you apply for FEMA aid, you have to have two different documentations that explain your ownership of the house and your occupancy of the house, but because of rural Appalachia standards and living situations, the houses are passed down through generations, and deeds and these documents get lost in the process, which results in them having an insufficient application. Another finding that I found during this project was that FEMA allotted $2.2 million to repair homes in Perry County, Kentucky, which only resulted in around $6,470 per household for repairs. But as I said, most of these households were being completely wiped off of their foundations, and that was just not enough. But in comparison, Team Eastern Kentucky Flood Relief, which is a state-run charity founded after the flood, allocated over $6.5 million in similar funds for relief, and FEMA was unable to do so. So part of my project was conducting a mental model to get a better understanding of community knowledge and stakeholder knowledge within the flood and get a better understanding of the timeline of events that took place. For this, I interviewed 4 of my friends and 1 local government official within Perry County. The first person I interviewed was Alara Parsons of Allen, Kentucky. It's 1 county over from Perry County. She lived through the flood and told me that she was completely unaware of how severe it was. None of her family knew, but once it started raining, they knew it was going to be bad. During her time helping rebuild the community, she noticed that there were FEMA officials in the area, and she mentioned a few community members in her church had received aid, but that was all she could tell me. Luke Glazer was the local government official that I interviewed. He's a city commissioner for the city of Hazard, which is Perry County's main city. He noted that FEMA was incredibly frustrating to work with, and many people did not receive aid when they had no reason but to, they had to be accepted, and they were completely denied. He also mentioned that it did work for some people, but for others, FEMA was not the best route. I interviewed 3 people from on this college campus who are outside of the area, 1 being from North Carolina, 1 from California, and 1 from Connecticut. None of them had any knowledge of the incident despite it making national news, and they had very limited knowledge of floods, but they were completely shocked to hear of how inefficient and unsuccessful FEMA has been in recovery efforts. This is an example of my mental model. It's a little confusing to follow, but this just helped me break down the series of events of the flood and what people knew before, as it happened, and afterwards. So part of my project was also to analyze a document within the risk communication. So I chose to analyze the Survivors Road to Recovery document on the FEMA website. This document aims at explaining the process to people and breaking it down so that people with lower education backgrounds will be able to comprehend it better. But as I went through it, I figured out that the document is very vague and unspecific, which led to more confusion when people apply. The document is also very hard to find on the page. You have to navigate under several tabs and find yourself in the individuals and households program, and then find this. It is supposed to explain the regulatory and eligibility procedures, but as I went through the document, I found that several documentation requirements were left out. Specifically, the household occupancy and ownership documents were completely not mentioned in this road to recovery document, which resulted in 40% of FEMA applications in the flood being denied. I also noted that their chosen form of communication for this document was on a website, which poses another threat to low-income and rural areas because most of these areas do not have stable internet connection or access to technology, especially after a flood. Another part of this document was their vague language, as I mentioned earlier, which allotted a lot of high application denial rates. The document is supposed to articulate the risk and the importance of the document in an action-oriented manner so that people will understand what steps they need to take to receive aid. But I noticed that the directions they give are very vague and lackluster, and they're supposed to be explanatory and simple for all backgrounds to understand, but they left out a lot of key details. For example, this page noted, if you had disaster-caused damage to your home and personal property, FEMA may verify the damage through an on-site or remote inspection. It does not tell you how, what will be expected of you, how they will connect with you for that, and what sort of damage you have to your house. It's completely vague and unspecific, which led to a lot of confusion when applying. So another part of my project was to do a sort of cycle of documentation that I was taught by my professor, Beverly Sauer, and she explained that this kind of helps understand the specific document and how that process works throughout the risk. So this is an example of my cycle of documentation that explained how the FEMA aid process works and where we find that low-income areas are being denied, and then we realize the process never really adjusts. So moving on, part of part of my project was to discuss recommendations for better risk communication in the FEMA agency and their document. So I recommended that FEMA starts to see themselves less as an external organization and start speaking more directly with local organizations and local people when they are in the area, so that they will better be able to explain to their people how to apply for aid and how to rehabilitate themselves, so that the rebuilding process can come to an end and that people will not have to be in a constant rebuilding process after disaster strikes, especially in these rural and low-income areas. I also recommended that FEMA shifts their tone to be more explanatory and less simplistic. While that may seem appealing for all backgrounds of education, having simple tone and verbiage causes a lot of confusion and gray area, when if the agency were to be more in-depth, it would be easier for everyone to understand. I also recommended that community stakeholders try to be the translator between FEMA and their constituents to prevent this. Further recommendations that I made were when I met with Tony Pippa of the Brookings Institute, who runs the Reimagine Rural podcast, and the City Commissioner of Hazard, Luke Glazer. They discussed that federal collaboration with local organizations and nonprofits, churches, charities would better benefit these people, especially in rural areas. I also recommended that FEMA prioritize traditional routes of communication and less modern communication, such as the website and online documents. These are my sources, and thank you for your time.
All right. So thank you to all the speakers. So we now have some time for questions. You can ask a specific speaker a question. You can ask a more general question that the panel can discuss. So I want to start us off.
This can go to anyone, but do you guys have any advice for when conducting your UW projects, and like what resources really helped you find the information you were looking for?
I can start. Well, as I mentioned in my slide, like really the databases that the GW library has is really in-depth and more than what I thought I would find. So instead of just like looking up fishing sector, like a China economy, or like fish trade, I got like so many sources and it was very overwhelming. Whereas if I went to these specific databases, a lot of it was more visual and more graphs, which helped me to like kind of understand what was going on and where I needed to take my data.
Yeah, for me, I definitely thought that making sure I documented everything throughout the process and kept track of everything in one place made things a lot easier to compile in the end. My project ended up being pretty long. It was around like 26 pages, I think, with citations and stuff. So making sure I had all of my resources and stuff in one document and my notes in one document made things a lot easier for me.
I think for me, like I was almost being asked to research in a way that like was very foreign, because I had never been asked to, like, normally when you write a paper, at least like a history paper, for example, like you're asked to do like primary and secondary sources, but in the end those are all like historical sources. But for me, I was being asked specifically like, oh, besides archaeology, like find sources from other disciplines. But I actually think that even though it was like more difficult at first, I think it ended up helping a lot, because then I wasn't confined just to like looking at only archaeology. Like I was able to look at like the cookbook, for example, which is a piece of history, primary source from history, or like look at art from like I showed, that was part of an art collection from the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. So I think for me, my research process was a little bit different from what I was used to, but it just was really helpful to be able to draw from those like different disciplines.
Just as a follow-up to that, I think it's really interesting because the three projects are quite different in the way that they're using resources. Can each of you talk a little bit about the types of resources that you kind of relied on most heavily, and just like physically, what was that? Are you talking scholarly book? Yeah, I mean, obviously you had a cookbook, but were there scholarly sources, or was it more the artifacts themselves for you and for each? You know, so start with you, Jen, and then kind of go backwards.
I would say, I think of course like archaeology was the biggest, or scholarly sources in archaeology was one of the biggest like the bulk of my research. It was mostly about like castle excavations or data on like who ate what, or like what kind of meat was being eaten during the medieval period between those years that I researched. But I think apart from that, like the art served a really specific purpose, and that purpose was really to kind of visualize and contextualize a piece of history regarding medieval foodways that you can't get with just archaeology alone. Archaeology it tells you a lot about like the scientific aspect of like what exactly people were eating, and you can make a lot of inferences from that based on archaeological findings, but it doesn't tell you things like how was color being used, or the different recipes that people were using at the time and what significance did those recipes hold. You can really only get that with like historical perspectives, or looking at, for example, paintings of like an aristocrat hosting a feast, or someone begging for food, which is something that I included in my paper. So I think that for me, like each of those sources had a really, really distinct purpose, but in the end they kind of all came together to really just prove how like my main research question was really looking at like how does food uphold medieval class divisions, or how does it show the intense class divide in feudal society.
Yeah, so my research was more direct. I spoke with, I was very lucky to be able to work with the city commissioner in Hazard over the summer before I came here. I worked with him, Luke Glazer, and the mayor of Hazard, Mayor Malvolini. So I spoke directly with them and got a lot of information about the flood and how it took place from them. And then I also worked with the guy at the Brookings Institute, senior fellow Tony Pippa, and he told me more about FEMA's inefficiency in different areas of the country that he's been focusing on in his podcast, Reimagine Rural Policy, and kind of specifically in North Carolina, how they had been working with local organizations, and that really helped. And then outside of that, I focused on a lot of academic work that stemmed mainly from Eastern Kentucky. Speaking about the floods, I read a book about the floods written by a community member in Hazard that I had met when I worked there. And I also focused on a thesis paper about sort of the same concept within FEMA and the flood, the specific flood, written at the Eastern Kentucky University. And so that really helped, those direct force of communication.
I would say I consulted a lot of like reports and like large organizations. So the Food and Agriculture Organization within the UN posts yearly reports on like each different sector for each country, so you can like see how things change and like where, and they also focus on like key problems within sustainability and like activities. So with the distant water fishing, that helped, and then each country posts their own report for their sectors. So I was able to look through those, and then other investigative organizations. So I would say like being able to see all the reports of what people are showing was very key to my research, to be able to show like where things are going wrong and where all these problems are stemming from.
Thank you. Other questions?
So Jen, I have a question for you. I was super interested in hearing about the different diets for ruling elite and for peasants in medieval England. I'm curious, in your research, did any exceptions turn up for, say, like what peasants were eating? I'm thinking like weddings, feasts, holidays, stuff like that. Was it different then?
Yeah, so actually, peasants occasionally would be able to have access to fresh meat, but that was really only for like a special occasion, like you mentioned, holidays, or like something festive, essentially. And then I think another interesting thing is that the church actually was really involved in dictating what people ate and when they could eat certain foods. So for example, during specific like religious holidays or religious observances, the elites were actually not really supposed to eat beef or pork. They were mainly restricted to eating fish. So I think there were exceptions in both classes of society, but definitely among the peasants, yeah, there were occasions where they had like a feast and then they would eat beef or meats like that. But it was mostly the meat that they're eating was mostly like salted or preserved. So yeah.
Other questions?
whomever you can feel free to ask about specific things, or if you might be thinking about your research project.
This question is also for Jen. So working with like multiple disciplines for research, did you ever run into like any contradictions between each discipline? And like, if you did, like how did you navigate that in your research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because actually in one of the paintings that I looked at, I didn't include it in the presentation, but one of the paintings was actually depicting a biblical scene where there's a wealthy aristocrat, and he's throwing a feast, and he's eating all this meat, and he's dining from like these silver plates. Silver plates and gold plates had actually really significant meaning in the cuisine of elite people in feudal England. But he was eating, holding this grand feast, and there was actually this beggar that was outside who was asking for food. And instead of offering the beggar food, his name's Lazarus, the beggar, he unleashed his guard dogs on him, and the beggar was eaten up. And interestingly enough, you would think that, because there was such class division, that it would be showing how, like peasants should stay in their own lane, and they shouldn't be asking for food, and but interestingly enough, it actually turned out to be the aristocrat, he went to hell for doing that, and the peasant went to heaven. So it was a really interesting kind of moral of the story of like how generosity matters. And I think for me, like what I took out of that was not necessarily the moral of like the generosity, which kind of contrasts with the intense class division at that time, but the fact that like you can see all of the elements of the aristocratic like cuisine within the painting, like the plates, the food that they're eating, the really just like stark divide between the guys, like literally the peasants outside of like the presumably like a castle or wherever the aristocrats holding the feast. So I think for me that was like really one of the only, not necessarily like a contradiction, but just kind of an interesting contrasting view that I encountered. So yeah.
In a typical, this is for Mariah, but in a typical disaster, which there aren't really typical, but the kind of risk model is to have an accident, investigate it, and then make recommendations for the future. And your process, which you didn't really explain because of time constraints, is different from that. And also the fact that you have this kind of second disaster that you talk about. Can you talk about how that process changes from that very simplistic problem?
Yeah, so I originally wanted to do my project on the flood itself and the disasters that came with that. Rural Eastern Kentucky is an area where it does flood a lot, and that's very common for us. So I was wondering kind of how this one came to be so bad and why recovery efforts were still going on as of right now. People are still being put into new homes from the flood. So I was very curious about how that happened, and as I started to get more into it and do a little bit more research and ask about it, it seemed to be that the area, as they continued to flood and rebuild, they were never able to fully rebuild themselves and recuperate from the last flood, which kept making future floods worse when it comes to rebuilding. And so I started to look into, okay, FEMA's the one who helps after the flood, let's see what they've done. And I landed on their application because that's where I found a lot of problems stemmed from. So in my paper, I kind of went through how the flood happened and the problems with that, and then attached that onto this happened, so people applied for disaster aid and assistance from FEMA, and that created just an even bigger problem. And that's where I really honed in on the risk communication in the document and the cycle of documentation.
Sebastian, I have a question for you. I'm curious. So this is perhaps a little bit extraneous to your actual research project, but more broadly and speculatively. What do you think it would actually take to prevent China from fishing illegally so frequently, seemingly?
So I did kind of look into this, and I was doing a little bit of research as I took my EW class in the fall of 2025, so last semester, and I was looking to see if anything new had come up and to see if there's changes. And I think that it would take more funding for smaller nations to patrol their borders. So if you look at Argentina or the Galapagos or Ghana or countries in West Africa, they don't have a large enough navy to police every inch of their border. So it's really hard to see where these ships are without the geolocation software, which is required to be on by law, by the UN law, but is often turned off to create plausible deniability. But there's very little you can say to avoid what you're actually doing. So I think that would require harsher enforcement and harsher protection. So that would be by the UN, which they were looking at harsher treatment of distant water fishing and like limitations to that because of the sustainability problems. And it will take more protection of a country's borders to keep out unwanted ships and regulate who's coming in and who's going out.
We just have a few more minutes. Does the audience have another question? If not, what I'll ask you is, many of the students here may be working on their own projects right now. Do you have any advice? What would have made things go more smoothly for you in hindsight? What can you help them with?
Yeah, I can start. If you're starting your project now, I would say be very aware of deadlines and pay very much attention to that and know how much time things are going to take. Don't run yourself down to the wire. Be very cognizant of how long this is going to take and a lot more time than you think you're going to need, because it's much better to be safe than sorry and be stressed out last minute for sure.
I'll add on to that. Definitely keep time constraints in mind, but also as you do your research, you're gonna have more questions, you're gonna want to research more things, so your paper's gonna expand a lot more than you think, which is why it's gonna take so much longer to actually go back and narrow it down. So especially give mind to how much time you have, and it will take longer than you allocate. So I think I probably gave myself around 2 weeks to do it, and it took me an extra week onto that. So it will take longer than you think.
I would say don't be afraid if your paper goes in a totally different direction, at least with if it's at a reasonable time. My paper, my research question, I did a lot of revising to it just because it was a very different way of researching than I had been used to. So for me, I hadn't even thought about using the cookbook until I actually met with Professor Quave, Dr. Quave, and I hadn't even thought about looking at paintings or arts, and so that was a totally new aspect that I had to add in, that I was interested in adding in too, but it was important to add in for the whole multidisciplinary perspective. So I think for me, it was important to keep myself on track, but also know that it's okay to go in new directions or add new information that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of adding before.
All right, but we do have another session coming in, so we're just going to wrap up now. But let's thank our speakers again. Thank you very much. Remind the students, if you have not yet signed in,